In part one of this video series, I gave you an introduction to competing secular social theories. And in part two, we talked about the liberal view. And now let's get back to Tim Keller's really helpful essay and tackle the one that we're really dealing with today, the postmodern, what I'll call the neo-Marxist view. Okay, so here we go. This is Keller's really very helpful essay, A Biblical Critique of Secular Justice and Critical Theory. Critical theory, you might have heard as critical race theory or CRT. This is what critical theory, critical race theory, it's all this postmodern view of justice or social justice. And so probably inside your company, the majority of diversity training today, it's all built on critical race theory, which is postmodern justice. Okay, in a lot of the universities today, this is the going viewpoint. Okay, so this is very relevant, very today. And so let's get at it. So here we go. This is in the previous. This is the individualistic end of the spectrum. This is the collectivist. This is postmodern. The central concern is not fairness but power. Okay, so here was the liberal view we just went over, and now let's get down to this is the utilitarian view. But now let's finally get down to the postmodern view, which is fixated on the issue of power. Okay. A just society subverts the power. A just society subverts the power of dominant groups in favor of the oppressed. In other words, it takes away some of the power from the dominant group in order for the weaker group or the oppressed group. That's really the goal of this understanding, because power is what is really what's important here. Okay, that's the goal of this view of justice. Okay, so here's the way Keller summarizes and starts to give you a description. The fourth justice theory in some ways is the newest on the scene, though it has an older pedigree. Drawing on the teaching of Karl Marx, what can be called postmodern critical theory, often called critical race theory, as I say to you today, has emerged very recently with its own account of justice, which is sharply different from the others. Like I said, this is not the same as liberal social justice, okay? Because it has taken shape more recently and has come on the scene so forcefully, we'll take more time to describe and interact with it. So here we go. Postmodern critical theory argues, first, the explanation of all unequal outcomes in wealth, well-being, and power is never due to individual actions or to differences in culture or to differences in human abilities, but only and strictly due to unjust social structures and systems. Remember how I emphasized in the liberal that they talked about equal opportunity. The goal of we're trying to establish fairness. And so not trying to establish the outcomes. So here, they're immediately fixed on unequal outcomes. If there's unequal outcomes, well, then there must be injustice because the structures and systems must be bad. But so outcomes are really what's immediately the fix. And if you see unequal outcomes, you can already infer injustice. But that is not how the liberal view saw it. The liberal view said, well, of course there can be unequal outcomes. The results can be different because, what's important if we're going to live in a fair society is that we should have a fairness of opportunity. And so if you let this person play baseball and this person play baseball, well, they should both be given a chance to try to succeed. But obviously the person with greater talent or works harder, they're going to have better results, right? And, we're just using sports, but like if this person, has more talent and studies harder and works a lot more hours, then aren't they going to, get a better job or go to a better school? And then, they're going to have better wealth. So that's up to the individual. The individual, it's based on your talent and how hard you work and your character and so forth. The results are, of course, going to be different. That's how that's what works in freedom. And, we live in an individual free society. And so that's how, liberal fairness should be in a just society. That's the older view, equal opportunity. But now, actually, what's really fixated upon is unequal outcomes, okay? And what's really important is not individual actions, but structural, unjust social structures and systems. This is what's really the fixation. So that's why so much of the understanding of social justice, you have to have a certain discourse and understand systems and structures and see the groups. The only way to fix unequal outcomes for the downtrodden is through social policy, never by asking anyone to change their behavior or culture. So here we go, through social polity. You know what this means? Through politics. Politics is about power. How do you change the power things? Well, you have to get into the laws and use the government. You have to use power, and then the government is going to use its power of coercion through the government to fix the social polity and make things more just, because the systems are what's stacked and what is unjust. Okay. Second, all art, religion, philosophy, morality, law, media, and politics, education, and forms of the family are determined not by true reason or truth, but by social forces as well. So there's these deep, powerful social forces, and they shape everything. There's some grain of truth to the social forces are very, very powerful, but it's like social forces are the most important thing. They're the real foundation. It's not these other much more complex things that different individuals and different even camps of people can take more seriously or less seriously, and all these different factors inside of a complex free society. But actually what we need is to understand the correct social forces. So everything is determined by your class consciousness and social location. Religious doctrine, together with all politics and law, are always at bottom, a way for people to get or maintain social status, wealth, and therefore power over others. So religion is even seen as this really fake thing. It's always this kind of hypocritical fake thing where people, it's not really about God or piety, or it's really always just about power, social status, wealth, and power. So it's a very, very cynical view. And it's always thinking that they could see through everybody else's motivations and that you could, reason away. The politics is this. No, that's just some kind of Democrat ideology, or it's an American ideology, or it's a Republican ideology. I know Americans say they believe in freedom and all this, but really that was all just hypocritical, because the deep thing are the social forces that have to do with power. This is the way it thinks. Third, therefore, reality is at bottom nothing but power. See, power is that you can see everything if you have the key to power. And if that is the case, then to see reality, power must be mapped through the means of intersectionality. The categories are race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, and sometimes others. So what there are different layers, the way these various categories intersect to see how much privilege or power you have or how oppressed you are. So if you're a white, male, straight, cisgender, which basically means your more typical way of thinking about gender, then you have the highest amount of power. If you are none of these at all, you are the most marginalized and oppressed, and there are numerous categories in the middle. So for instance, let's just say if you're gay and you're black and you're a woman, then you tend to be at the bottom. But if you are, like male and you're straight and you're white, you tend to be at the top. But what if you're like Asian and you are straight and you are female? Well, you are, less oppressed than the black lesbian, but more oppressed than the white, heterosexual male, right? So, there's more intersection of oppression if you are, depending on where you are on that scale. So most importantly, each category toward the powerless and discretion has greater moral authority and a greater ability to see the way truly things are. They really can know because they can feel the oppression, they experienced it, and their experience of oppression is what gives them true moral power and authority. Only powerlessness and oppression bring moral high ground and true knowledge. They have the key to seeing the real truth of the world. Everybody else is kind of blinded and just walking through and hypocritically just trying to operate inside of their privilege, okay? Therefore, those with more privilege must not enter into any debate. They have no right or ability to advise the oppressed, blinded as they are by their social location. They simply must give up their power. This is why this view of justice is so illiberal, it's so intolerant. This is why anybody, if you are higher up on their, So it's like there's a totem pole of how oppressed you are. If you're more on the bottom, you're actually got the most power and the most moral authority. So it's really it's weirdly flipping things up, but it's like this. So if you're like a white male Christian, then basically you should just shut up. You can never talk. If they somehow else give you their perspective, their truth trumps anybody else's truth. And if you and it's utterly unjust for you to assert anything in there. That's why everybody gets scared and quiet. And that's why immediately they begin to say they're unjust, except the words today is they don't go say you're unjust. They actually, especially within the racial categories, they say you're racist. See, racist is unjust. It's the same thing, right? Fourth, the main way power is exercised is through language, through dominant discourse. A dominant discourse is any truth claim, whether grounded in supposed reason and science or in religion and morality. Language does not merely describe reality, it constructs or creates. So our language is shaping and it's like, it's kind of partway true, but it's like language is really power as opposed to description. Like we see what this is a chair, is a chair. You're not making the chair happen. You just, your language is describing the reality. But this is more like in terms of the social fabric, the language makes the reality. And there's some minor truth to that, but it's really overstated. But here's this thing is dominant discourse, which is those who have the dominant power. They shape the language and then they thus make truth, and then they're kind of bamboozling everybody to kind of like fit their power structures. And so when I was doing my master's work, like there was this terminology. Let's say, for instance, if you were gay, you tended to see yourself as oppressed in this framework. So, this is the new justice, but this has been around ever since the 90s. When I was in the 90s, when I was doing my master's work at Harvard, they used this kind of language. And so one of the things they would call heteronormative discourse. You notice, because if you were heterosexual sexuality was considered normative, and heterosexual normativity was a discourse where they would go down and oppress all the sexual minorities who are oppressed on the bottom. See, this is the way it was thought. And all the heteronormative majority people would use their dominant discourse. It was the more fancy term was called hegemonic discourse. Hegemony means to have power and impose it upon others using this language and making the world that was advantageous to them. Hegemonic discourse, one version of hegemonic would be heteronormative discourse. And so this was around even in the 90s, and it was incredibly divisive, and it created lots of resentment and anger even back then. And now this thing is just kind of like unleashed all throughout. It was just kind of like only at Harvard, and even then at Harvard, only within certain kind of radical social circles that were starting to change the definition of justice, even back then, from the liberal to this view. It wasn't called postmodern back then, but it was already starting to arise in the 90s, and now this is like all over the place. It's full born all throughout our culture. Okay. Let's see. Power structures, all right, mask themselves behind the language of rationality and truth. There's not real rationality and truth. See, you can just see through rationality and truth. So academia hides its unjust structures behind talk of academic freedom, and corporations talk of free enterprise, science behind talk of empirical objectivity, and religion talk of divine truth. All these things, it's all just hypocritical, just lies. That's what they think. And so if you really think about it, this is like acids, like the acids of like, tearing away at like academic freedom. This is why this is a real threat to the university today, or free enterprise, certainly a threat to, a lot of people think that all these people who are Christians or Jews or whatever the religion is, they're not really interested in divine truth. They're just trying to impose heteronormative discourse on gay people, for instance. It's just a use of power. It's an unjust form of oppression, right? It's even, putting away empirical objects is actually a threat to science itself. So I want you to understand, this is really, really serious business here where we are. It's a very dangerous place in society. It's actually even a threat to the sciences and to empirical objectivity, right? All of these seeming truth claims are really just constructed narratives, stories designed to dominate, and as such, they must be unmasked. Deconstruction is like, it's often the term it's called, unmasked, right? Reason, debate, and freedom of speech, therefore, is out. It's a huge threat to freedom of speech. And it only gives unjust discourse airtime. So you can see this today. Anytime anybody wants to say anything that's like, that even disagrees, oh, they're unjust, they're racist, we have to shut them up. They're racist people are like, they use their verbal violence. Okay, they're really bad, and they're going to hurt and harm, especially oppressed people. So they have to be made to shut up. And freedom of speech, no. Well, that's if we allow freedom of speech, all this unjust discourse will come out. And so the only way to reconstruct realities in a just way is to subvert dominant discourses, and this requires control of speech control, even more than just even thought control. Speech control. And controlling speech is trying to control what people even think. Or if they think something different, they sure aren't allowed to say it, right? Fifth, cultures, like persons, can be mapped through intersectionality. So cultures can be done this way too. In one sense, no culture is better in any regard from any other culture. All cultures are equally valid, but people see their cultures as better and judge other cultures inferior, or even people who see their own cultures as normal and judge other people as exotic, are members of an oppressive, racist culture even. And oppressive cultures are, though this word is not used, inferior and to be despised, but the word they do use is racist. Of course, racist is inferior. It's actually much worse than say it's awful. And so there is this really false idea that all cultures are kind of like equal and equally valid, but that's simply not true. Certainly not equal on all points. All cultures, there's no like superior culture, like on an absolute level. But we believe in the Bible, and the Bible gives us a transcendent moral standard that can judge all nations. Because God is above all nations. He's no respecter of any culture or race or even of individuals. And we can look at individuals, and the Bible says all individuals and all nations will be judged by God, because God is utterly just and righteous, and his standard is just and righteous. But you can go look at this culture, and you're saying, you can't, there's no way, of course, we can say this culture is straight up superior to this culture. But what you can say is, on this culture, their way of approaching fatherhood actually is better than this culture. This culture has a lot of really like irresponsible of men who just abandon their responsibilities as fathers. And, this is family and fatherhood is really bad inside this culture. And this culture does fatherhood better. We can do that. Of course we can do that. This culture is better on getting a lot of their poor and younger people to get better education, and unleashes much more of their talent and better human flourishing on education than this culture. Of course you can make that judgment. So even this demand, it's very, very unreal. It's it's a kind of false, deceitful way of trying to demand an equality of in reality that's just not even real at all. So finally, neither individual rights nor individual identity are primary. Traditional liberal emphasis on individual human rights, such as private property, free speech, is an obstacle to the radical changes society will need to undergo in order to share wealth and power. Share wealth and power, that's what's important. And it is an illusion to think that as an individual, you can carve out an identity in any way different, independent of others in your race, ethnicity, gender, and so on. Group identity and rights are the only real ones. Guilt is not assigned on the basis of individual action, but on the basis of group membership and social racial status. So they immediately, that's why they can say, oh, you're male, you're white. Okay, well, you're in one group, and we can just judge you, and we can know, like where you kind of are, because we have this kind of new kind of like, it's like we could replace the Bible, we could replace the Ten Commandments, we can replace any other kind of, we can replace even fairness, because fairness isn't what's important. Power, equality is what's important. Okay. So I know this is already a lot to take in. Let's just say first, just let's see if I can briefly hit some of the critiques that Keller goes over. First, it's deeply incoherent. I already told you this doesn't even make sense. It's just unreal, right? If all truth claims and justice are socially constructed to maintain power, then why aren't the claims and judgments of the adherents of this view subject to the same critique? Exactly. If nobody has a real like objective truth claim, why is theirs and everybody else is just why aren't they just imposing their part? Well, maybe that's all that they're doing too. Why are the postmodern justice advocates' claims that this is oppression unquestionably morally right, as if they have some kind of infallible key to moral justice, which they don't? So this is incoherent. It kind of undermines itself logically. Second, it's far too simplistic. I won't go into that. I already told you, like, the world doesn't work this way, right? Third, it undermines common humanity, absolutely. So biblically, we are primarily individuals of God made in his image and secondarily members of a race or that's in Christ, where your fundamental identity is who you are as a human being in Christ. And then, yeah, it's still real that you're male or you're, 21st century American, or whether you're white or whether you're black or whether you're Chinese or something like this. But your deep fundamental humanity is what's precious and important. You're made in the image of. This is the way the Bible looks at it. But even then, this is a much more realistic way of dealing with our neighbors, but it undermines that. Fourth, it denies our common sinfulness. And nobody has some special form of righteousness. Being oppressed doesn't make you more right. The Bible doesn't say the poor are more righteous than the rich, or certainly, some societies think that the rich are somehow better than the poor, but the Bible doesn't believe in either of those, that you can be rich and sinful and righteous, and you could be poor and sinful and righteous, and there's a common sinfulness. There's a common, there's a deep common problem, whether you're rich, whether you're poor, whether you're oppressed, whether you're dominant. And this is a much more realistic. It's not only the biblically true, it's a much more realistic way of looking at life. Fifth, it makes forgiveness, peace, and reconciliation between groups impossible. Absolutely right. Right. He quotes Miroslav Volf, a theologian: forgiveness flounders because I exclude the enemy from the community of humans, even as I exclude myself from the community of sinners. So it's like those people who think they have the more greater righteousness because they have been oppressed, they now can utterly hate and condemn. Like, they're white, they're perpetrated systemic justice, and now we can just despise them, we can condemn them, we can hate them, and treat them as if they're second class or even worse in society. And that's what's going on in our society. And everybody's afraid to be put into that camp and despised and rejected or fired and seen as beyond the bounds of respectable society in America now. And sixth, it suffers a highly self-righteous performative identity. So people feel like they can go out and perform an identity, like, so it's a kind of fake righteousness. So this is why you have this, if you go out and, protests, racial justice, social justice, more justice, and then, you're on the side of the oppressed, then you're more righteous. It's a lot of virtue signaling. And regardless of whether you really care about, poor people or Black folks or people who are truly oppressed, such as like we've been talking about in our series, like the widows or the fatherless. Okay. And finally, and this one's really important, it is prone to domination. This theory sees liberal values such as freedom of speech and freedom of religion as mere ways to oppress people. And so this is why it's grabbing after power and domination. It's highly illiberal, highly intolerant. It's a straight up threat to a free American society, but it's also just a threat to just being able to be a human being, to be free and pray, or to think about God, or to question or have discussions about God. This is a real serious threat. To have beliefs about God that disagree with other people in society, which was one of the really beautiful things about American culture, is like, we can have disagreeing views, and we are now living in a free society where we can try to persuade other people. And today, this is a real threat to just the freedom to even preach the gospel in our society. If this viewpoint of justice comes reign, and really our political systems and things really break down, this is a really, really serious threat to American individual freedom, and certainly a threat to the free practice of our faith. So, brothers and sisters, I want you to really think about the threats of this postmodern view, this more neo-Marxist view of justice. It's not justice at all. In fact, I want to just go out and say it's fake justice. Don't listen to this view. Don't agree with this view. It deeply, deeply is like disagrees with the Bible, and it even disagrees with a much more reasonable and much more moderate view of justice, the older secular view of liberalism. And so please be very, very careful and don't agree with it. And instead, let's live inside of genuine justice. Let's seek God's justice, biblical justice. And even if it costs us, we must have courage, humility, definitely, but a confident, humble, courageous, joyful offering of genuine justice from God, which will never be defeated. It may feel like it, but we need to stand up against this fake postmodern justice, not this real social justice doctrine that is coming about and is being jammed upon us in our society. Thanks.